All right. Today is November the 4th. This is the feature OM upstream working group focused on the feature development. And welcome everyone and thank you for joining. Let's take a quick look at the agenda today. We have quite a few things today actually. And I guess the first will be Chris Johnson on some of the operand tendency in our back, and then Evan would like to discuss a few enhancements that we were discussing from the last working group meeting, including the optional manifest, generic and cluster constraint, and the compile constraint. And then Chris also having another topic on dealing with the curated catalog. So let's get started from the top with Chris. Chris, are you here?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So go ahead and feel free to share screen if you need to.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, let me go share my screen here. I'm just going to share the agenda just so we have a talking point. Oh, Zoom, how do you work? There we go. Okay. So I've talked to several of you for the past several months on at IBM how we've built. We've got a pretty sophisticated or complex set of dependencies between all of our operators. And we have also some tenancy requirements. So we have all of our operators are built such that they can be installed in all namespace mode, or they can be installed in own namespace mode. And we have some customers who really like the fact that they can have their operands installed in multi-namespace mode. So I've kind of described before how we're using this hybrid concept where we're using the watch namespaces. So we're using own namespace mode, and we're using the watch namespaces environmental variable to be able to have that own namespace mode operator watch operand namespaces. So basically, we're trying to adopt a single tenant operator, right? So we're trying to go down that path of the future where all operators are singleton cluster scoped entities, and we're going to allow operands to be installed in a lot of different namespaces. So for example, you'd have all of your operators installed in one operator namespace, and you have lots of operand namespaces, maybe one per tenant, one for Coke, one for Pepsi, so forth. So looking at the new Maestro APIs that are proposed, I'm just wondering how we, if any thoughts, and that basically describes how an administrator could create features and feature bindings to be able to dynamically turn on pieces of the operator or features of the operand that the operator might act upon. So basically groupings of RBAC rules that could be propagated across the cluster to enable all that. So the piece that's missing is how does a manager or the operator controller dynamically figure out who it needs to operate upon? So before, we relied on watch namespaces and the operator groups to be able to do that. So what I'm wondering is, what is the thought process behind how the operator can be coded to be able to dynamically discover and be notified of any changes to the RBAC rules that the feature bindings are generating? That's the part that's missing from the link that's there. So for example, are we expecting the operator to continuously call the subject access review API, or to listen for every single RBAC rule and reevaluate everything? Are we expecting some other system to be able to inject continually use watch namespace to have some kind of veneer over top of that? Has any thought been given there yet?
This is Nick. I think part of the idea was that the operators could depend on the feature binding API, so they could watch that. You would, grant them access to that, and they could take it as a dependency. And when new feature bindings are created, they would look at that to know which namespaces they could have access to, etc. I will say that we've kind of started evaluating, I think I presented it a few weeks ago, the combo idea, where it's not just a feature binding, it's really just like a template of different resources. So you could imagine, one of the things that gets created is maybe a new config map or something in the namespace of the operator that it watches. So it doesn't even need to take a dependency on, the APIs itself directly at the code level. It could, have some other resource that it cares about that will get stamped out whenever you quote unquote bind with that API. I have the combo project right here that one of our
I took a peek
members-
at that, and I guess I wasn't quite sure if that was really meant to be part of the feature, or if it's just kind of a little playground thing you're messing with.
Yeah, it's serving a few different purposes, but one of them is as a generalization of what feature binding is doing, or what Maestro would be doing. So maybe instead of doing something that's specific to RBAC and rigorous like that, we do something like this that's a little bit more freeform for authors, give them a little bit more choice. That's not to say we wouldn't consider doing something like Maestro. It's just this is the route the investigation is taking right now.
All right, so I'm trying to wrap my head around what you just said. So, and I can't remember the combo. I remember looking at it, but I didn't really absorb it. And I saw it in your examples. So I think what you're saying is that combo or something like combo would be used to as an intermediary to watch for these feature bindings potentially, and generate a config map, and that config map could be the thing that is watched by the controller.
Essentially, like combo would have its own like concept of a feature binding, I guess you could say, more of a give me the arguments you want me to fill out in the template. So combo would be watching for those things and then stamp out the resources like the config map if it was defined in that template to do that. So like your operator has like a lot more choice about your operator author has a lot more choice about like what they watch or do to figure out the namespaces and different resources they need to look at.
So are you thinking that this is more, at least initially, this will be not part of the specification? This would be more of a pattern that people could employ in order to implement tenancy?
I personally think that like the tendency like for Maestro or for combo or whatever is always just something that you can like have as an add-on to OLM. Like OLM should be agnostic of it, and it's just like another dependency that you take to get this sort of scoping. So that's my personal thoughts. I'm not quite sure where everybody else in the project lands.
I think like the one concern I would have with that model, I'm not saying it's a bad model, but one thing we'd have to address would be like if every operator chooses a slightly different bolt-on method of controlling their tenancy, then cluster admins now have n number of tenancy APIs to worry about if they have n number of operators.
Yes.
That's fair. I think if you make one ubiquitous or generic enough, like combo, it could be included by default, or maybe we could even like enforce that that's the way you do it. But even that's not precluding you from, again, relying on some other thing installed elsewhere to do, you know, your own type of scoping.
So I don't see any references in here to your combo project. Could you put that in here again? And can you just kind of remind us what the combo project is? It's some kind of templating engine for kube resources, right?
Yeah.
For runtime resources versus static resources.
Yeah, exactly. It's like parameterize the configuration for your operator and then make it easy to do the sort of things feature binding would do, which is like stamp out combinations of resources for different names and namespace. So like, if you think about the multi-namespace mode that we've kind of eschewed, the way it works is like for every namespace that you have selected, it copies a bunch of RBAC in there, and there needs to be a bunch of resources created elsewhere. So the reason that like combo is its own sort of novel thing is because it generates combinations. That's where the name comes from. Generates combinations of like all of the parameters that you feed it with these CRs. So you can sort of scale out your config instantiation, if that makes sense, a little bit more easily.
So do you have examples of how this would be used in this context, in multi-tenancy context?
Yes, I do. Let me just get that. I need to just get the agenda.
Yeah, I may have seen it, but I just came back from vacation, so my mind is a little bit not quite up to speed, and so I might be missing it. And there's a lot of information changing a lot. You guys have been busy with a lot of EPs.
Yeah.
So
totally.
so while you're looking for this, I guess for the broader audience, I guess our watch namespace is a thing of the past then with the new API. I'm assuming they are. And then, well, how does the Ansible operator do with it? Clearly, it's got to also deal with some kind of multi-tenancy paradigm, right?
I'll take a stab at
Joe.
I think it is a thing of the past, because OLM seems like it's going in the direction of like, we're not telling the operator which namespaces it's watching, which means like, how would we possibly set watch namespaces? In terms of the Ansible operator and the Helm operator, obviously the SDK team will have to adapt to that and make that configurable in another way. I don't think we have a really good answer for that yet, though, at least on the Ansible and Helm operator side.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to throw it out there because I think all of this stuff is starting to gel, right? So I think in the next 6 months or so, I think we're probably going to start seeing some feature binding work happen, right? So I guess what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get prepared, because it takes us a long time to pivot, and especially because we have over 100 operators in our catalog, and they're already and they have interdependencies upon each other, and so there's no way we're going to be able to cut and run and just start using the new API and the old API. So we have to use them both at the same time, and we would really like to have our operator implementations be, allow it to coexist and not have to have, forks and different streams all the time. Because our teams are kind of screaming that it's really, really hard to have so many delivery streams. And so they're really liking to have, as few as possible. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm trying to figure out how we can start planning, for the happy path moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's part of the acceptance criteria for a lot of these designs is how do we do, what does the upgrade path look like to GA for this? And part of that is how do you migrate existing clusters to new clusters and content to use these new APIs without like severely impacting users or requiring tons of manual intervention.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So that's is part of the acceptance criteria, I'm pretty sure, for like all of our enhancements.
Okay. So when do you guys have a timeline of when you guys are going to start iterating a little bit more seriously onto this? I know I've seen some Red Hat timelines. I was just wondering from an upstream perspective. And if you guys have an idea of when you guys are going to start iterating on it, because this feature binding stuff and config manager and things are a little bit, they've been out there for a while. I don't think they've changed a lot recently. I haven't looked at the data in this one particular document, but is this something that's going to happen like within the next few months? And is this something I can help with and get involved in, or? I know a lot of stuff happens kind of behind the scenes, because this meeting only happens 1 hour every 2 weeks. And so obviously there are lots of other design decisions going on and meetings going on outside of the scope of this meeting.
So yeah, I mean, what I would say is we're definitely trying to take this as much upstream first as possible. So I think right now our focus is we have this combo project that we've started iterating on upstream. If you take a look at the combo project, there's a whole bunch of GitHub issues. That's kind of where all of that work and design is sort of being tracked. So if you have interest in contributing to it or testing it, or being an initial user of it, that's kind of where I would look first. If there's anything on that project where certain things aren't clear, I think it probably makes sense to try to talk about it in that context. But that's the only place where we're actively like doing any real iteration or development right now. Unless there's somebody on the call that is actually working on something and I just don't know. But that's what I am aware of right now.
I would, yeah, so I agree with everything Kevin said. I'm not personally involved in some of the development of some of this stuff, but what I would be interested in seeing for myself, and I think it would help you guys at IBM, would be if we set up like a more in the weeds, talking about actual implementation details of some of these new APIs, like as we start actually implementing them, so that we can do like upstream demos and get feedback about, implementation decisions and design decisions, and maybe do that on a more regular basis, just so we get that faster upstream feedback. And then also, like, if you guys have cycles, like, I think we would be completely open and really, really willing to collaborate on the actual implementation. So like, if we have some stories that we need help implementing, like if you guys are willing to do that, let's do it, right? This is an upstream community.
Yep, I agree on everything you said. So yeah, if we could get more I guess visibility onto some of the day-to-day and get feedback, that'd be great. I think we can definitely do the feedback side. I've got lots of interested parties. Implementation is a little harder, but clearly we've done that before, and we have some ability to do that, but we're not involved in it day-to-day like you guys, so it's a little tricky, especially since there's no real, I guess, spec on the implementation itself.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting at. Like, if we can define some of those in the open and then have like very well defined, here's what we need to implement, we just haven't done it yet. You know, I'm not saying like it would have to be something that you guys implement, but just the ability for anyone to come in and be able to implement it, whether it's IBM or anybody else, I think is something that we should try to do and encourage.
Yes, yes, that would be perfect.
Yeah, so we're for at least combo 2, we're trying to go that way. Actually, in 1 second, you should be able to update this, and the README will have changed because something just merged. And so down at the bottom now, we have a bunch of different, plan features and different things like that. So one of them is contribution guidelines, the CI/CD, the controller, all that. So like, if you go up to the top of the page too, you can go to the projects in the top right tab. Straight up.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So go to combo. And we have a bunch of different stories here. So I think the next thing to do is to get RuckPack, the repository, in a similar state, and then start scheduling some meetings specifically for that. But yeah, it's in a similar state, but it's a little bit like not as clean as this, and it doesn't really have a backlog. This is really tightly scoped, so it's a little bit easier.
Yeah, this is awesome. This is way beyond what I remember it being. So clearly this is very fresh. This is good.
Cool.
Yeah, this looked like a little simple utility before, but now it looks definitely more fleshed out and more real. So yeah, this is really good. So yeah, so I guess whatever you guys can do to maybe start spearheading some more public discussions on this and these topics, we could definitely, me for sure, right? So, and I've got some people on my team who are interested in these kinds of things as well as also other teams. I know we go in cycles, and so there's some teams that are probably this quarter or early next quarter are going to be doing a deep dive into multi-tenancy. And they're going to be interested in how we're going to design our tenancy with the future in mind, right? And so this is going to be super important. Okay, so I think we've talked this one to death. I think this has really been helpful for me to get going.
All right. Thank you, Chris. So I guess that is the end of the first item, and then let's move on to the next one. So I think the next item basically from Evan, but essentially what Evan wanted to just discuss a few pending enhancement that we brought up from the last meeting, including the optional manifest and several constraint related enhancement that currently pending on the enhancement repo. And I guess we can just basically circle back to the enhancement real quick to see if any further thought or discussion or question or any feedback that we want to discuss directly on this meeting. I guess we can start with the optional manifest. Is there any further input, feedback from that specific enhancement regarding the fact that we want to having certain optional info on the manifest that inside a bundle that that OM may or may not install in the cluster, depending on if it's optional or not. The current usage is using label annotation, I think, on the manifest. And we can actually consume the enhancement edit days. It should work, but is there any concern, question, feedback on that specific topic? So
This one is merged. This one's merged already, right?
Sorry,
So
which one is this one?
The optional manifest.
optional manifest.
I think it's.
I don't think that's
close to
merged.
it.
I think that's just the raw file of the PR.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Well, I skipped reviewing this one because I thought it had merged.
Yeah, I think that's a PR number 95 and it's still open.
All right. Well, I haven't looked at it since last week because, like I said, when I went to look, I thought it was merged. But I put these on here just because these are all things that we discussed at the last call, and I think we had action items to review them, and so I just wanted to follow up and see. I reviewed 2 of them today. I wasn't sure what are the next steps for these 4 enhancements that we talked about last time.
Yeah, I mean, for this specific enhancement, I feel like the main question is that a better solution than just using label and annotation on the manifest? Is there more, I don't know, API friendly solution for this besides just using annotation and label? Even though the existing solution using annotation and label is certainly simple and can be implementable right away. But not sure if that's something we want to move forward with. Any thought on that?
It seems
so
like-
does look.
oh,
Oh,
go ahead.
No, go for it.
I was just gonna say, like,
Go ahead, Nick.
yeah, so your synopsis is correct. It seems like we're in an impasse with the person who submitted the proposal. Basically, I think the team thinks that it should be a property, and the implementation that was given was annotations for this extra data. And it doesn't seem like the author has agreed to meet us there with it. So we should probably decide whether we want to either close the PR or how we want to approach conflicts like that.
Nick, I think the statement is not correct. We discussed that 2 weeks ago, and we had also a lot of chat. So I was open to have a different design. We discussed several options, and you say you want to get property, but I worked around the option of setting a property and mentioned today the property you have at the API level, so cover these aspects. So it's not possible to do that with a package manifest. You need to do that with the API versions or CRD dependency. And my understanding from this discussion we had 2 weeks ago is that you preferred not to have that. So I'm open with one or the other approach, but I don't think that's saying what you're saying. It's very progressing, helping with progressing the discussion. So if you want to have it on property, then make a statement where you want to have it, how you want to have it, let's discuss that. But saying, yeah, that's not the right place, it's not helping.
Okay, yeah, thank you for refreshing my memory. The other, yeah, like I think when we originally saw this, we thought the scope was just applying optional manifest, not sort of changing resolution, dependency resolution, which is a much broader subject. So yeah, I don't have anything further to
Yeah, so
say about
I try to write all the different options in the alternative of the enhancement proposal at the bottom. And apart from having optional dependencies, we say it is a bigger subject. So there is the option to put it at the manifest level or to put it to create explicit binding between resources and the package, which doesn't exist at the time being. So there is no reference in the properties that you specify at your bundle level about different manifests are populated in the manifest directory. So my understanding was that there is no no specification or no design decision made on having that. If that's the way you want to have it, and again, let's put it on paper and discuss the pros and cons and whether that's doable.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. It seems like we probably need to iterate a little bit on what a spec for manifest specific metadata like that would look like in the bundle metadata. So probably outside the scope of maybe this meeting, maybe we want to start having a conversation in the OLM dev Slack channel in the Cube Slack and kind of go from there. I'm personally a little bit lost because I'm not sure I remember all the context of everybody who's been talking about this, and it hasn't been in one place. So maybe it would be good to kind of like restart that conversation, or if anybody has any strong opinions, maybe we can congregate, like I said, either in Slack or maybe on the enhancement pull request. I think either one is fine.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I would favor to have this discussion on the pull request directly, because I think it's easier, to have things in one place.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds reasonable. So it seemed like there's a few discussion going on here. So if any feedback, even any reason why we should closing the PR on any alternative solution, so to speak, on this specific topic, you should comment that on the PR so Federated can respond to it and begin to having some further discussion on that. And maybe if the conversation go long, it move over to Slack if that's easier, but at least some of the main topic and main feedback should be on the PR, so it can be traced back to the conversation starting there. So it seems like that's going to be it for the optional manifest for now. And let's move on to the next enhancement. At least on the same library, actually two different enhancements on the generic constraint and the cluster constraint. They're two separate enhancement. So let's start with the generic constraint. I know that's seems to be a really hot topic with a lot of feedbacks and comment in there. And I recently just updated a little bit as well with some of the alternative syntax and so on the enhancement. I think this morning some people may not have seen it yet, but it's been up there, and I actually having another update that coming on some of another thing as well. But it seemed like the main feedback I got from the comment so far is that the usage of cell expression it seems reasonable, but most of the contentious discussion is on the syntax itself, how to make it a little bit more user friendly. And even though the intention is to make it expandable in the future, but it should not be too confusing or too convoluted to the point that the bit extending it only make it worse in terms of UX. So that's why I actually add to the already existing alternative syntax on one of them, and then I adding another one that's pretty new that I have been discussing with Joel and Bert before. So is there any specific thought, discussion on vocab, syntax, situation, problem that you may have, feel free to speak up now, because I think that seems to be the most contentious point of this enhancement.
I mean, I guess I would say that looking at the enhancement, I much prefer the simplified constraint at the end. And I don't know that the case is made clear to me why we would add the complexity of the rest of it.
Yes, let me see if I can share screen real quick, just to make sure everyone can see it. Give me a second.
I think it looked to me like Joe had similar comments about that, but maybe I missed.
Yeah, so one of the alternative at the bottom of the enhancement basically is the simplified cell constraint type. That essentially this is the simplified syntax that specifically for cell, as you can tell from the type that's OLM.constraint cell. So this is basically a custom constraint type that for cell specifically that allow you to basically specify cell expression, and OLM will evaluate it accordingly. And this is strictly for cell, so that means if you're gonna having another expression language that you may support in the future, you basically need to create a new type. So that's one of the downside of that specific design. But you know, if cell is the only language, or at least for the foreseeable future that we want to support, then this syntax should work well just fine. The reason for a little bit more complex, not complex, but a little bit more expandable syntax is basically the notion that the thought that we may want to support another language in the future, and we want to reusing the same type, which is OLM constraint. And the only thing changing to make it able to using another language, basically the evaluation field here, essentially, that when you can specify a new type, a new language via the ID field, and potentially some additional field that specifically for that language as well, you know, maybe versioning, package, and so on. And if you're changing the evaluation field struct specifically here, the only thing you're changing is just the evaluator struct, and then potentially whatever expression for that specific language in the rule field here, and the type remaining the same, OLM constraint. So it's just changing up evaluator. So that's the reason behind that, to make it a little bit more expandable, and expandable meaning a little bit more field, a little bit more complex in terms of syntax here. So that's the reason behind that mostly. But if we don't feel like it's worth doing so, and we rather to let the type to be specifically for cell, and then adding a new type in the future for another language if we choose to do so, I think that's a reasonable trade-off in terms of like complexity of the syntax, and of course the readability of the syntax itself as well. So I'm open for that. So that's why it's an alternative, and it seems like Evan is a fan of it. And I know, and this original proposal so come from Joe, so he probably having obviously that strong feeling about it as well. But is there anyone else having any thought on this?
So I'll chime in here too. So Evan, I originally I think I was agreeing with you that like this very simple, like let's come up with what we think cell specifically needs is best, because then as like we come up with you know, different constraint types, then each of those can have their own specific struct that makes sense in the context of that constraint, rather than having to commingle all of these fields that we're trying to make some generic abstraction for that might not necessarily fit. So I like 100% agree with that concept. I think the place that I get tripped up a little bit with using the root level type is that we get into a version skew problem where certain versions of OLM understand certain types of constraints. And like, what then do we do when we see a constraint that we don't recognize, right? Like right now, since constraints are properties, a constraint that we don't recognize is just another property, which would mean we just ignore it. And if we ignore it, does that then like break some very important thing that the operator wants to convey about a constraint that they aren't able to meet now because we just don't recognize that as a constraint? So I think Vu, you recently updated this to like have yet another potential option, which is something that looks somewhat like the Kubernetes volume struct, which is basically like it says like, here's my volume, but then the struct itself is like every different volume implementation gets its own subfield, and then the subfield of each of those volume implementations has its own struct that has like the sub configuration just for that implementation. So it's kind of a hybrid where like the root type is always going to be OLM.constraint so that we can tell that it's a constraint. But then if your subtype is something we don't recognize, then we can choose to fail or ignore depending on whether the constraint says it's optional or required, for example. So I think like the one thing that is not covered by having the root types just all be different is that we can't tell the intent of that thing if we don't know that it's a constraint. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I think you're making sense. I guess I'm still. I think it's like a bigger can of worms though. Like it's not obvious to me that it's safe to ignore constraints ever, and it's not obvious to me that there's a substantial difference between the resolver supporting a specific constraint type and the resolver understanding a specific evaluator type, if that makes sense. Like both of those things are things that the resolver will have to be configured to understand one way or the other. And I guess your point is with the generic constraint type, then there's potentially like fallback or ignore logic that we can use, especially if it's like optional.
I guess my larger point right now is that there is no concept of optional right now with constraints, so they're all required. And if we encode constraints as just new property types, there will be old versions of OLM that are unaware that a certain property type is actually intended to be a constraint because we didn't have support for that constraint in that older version, right? So I don't think we're going to backport every constraint type to every old version of OLM. So the problem then is if someone has a bundle that has that constraint that they intend to be a constraint, but then they try to install it in a cluster with an older version of OLM that doesn't know about it, then it just looks like an opaque property and we're going to ignore it.
Yeah, I think at one point maybe there's even an enhancement for it, but I thought we had talked about a negotiation of a protocol. Sorry about the docs, where the resolver would need to look at all the properties and constraints that are supported by the catalog and that it's talking to, and then either fail or make a decision about whether or not it's allowed to deal with that, almost like a Cypher suite negotiation with a TLS handshake, that kind of thing. Because I mean, even in the case, like I agree, like it shouldn't fail ideally if you try and ship it to a version of OLM, or maybe it should. The catalog as a whole shouldn't fail. But if the version of OLM that's trying to resolve it can't understand the constraint, then it's probably going to do something unintended anyway. And it's not clear to me that we'll be able to make a good decision in that case.
So
yeah,
go ahead.
Allow me to say real quick. I mean, I just want to supporting what John said. This is not a new problem for OM in any way. The fact that if you go back to the old reservoir in the older version of OM that doesn't support the dependency YAML file that you have, then you basically, if you declare that in a bundle and you're having some package with GPK dependency on it, and if you ship it in the own OM with the own resolver, it clearly will not understand that at all. So this is not a new problem with the fact that certain thing that belong to a new feature that cannot be backported to the older feature, and OM basically just ignoring it and until the resolver, we're basically ignoring those kind of things. And it may result into something unexpected. For example, if you actually declare dependency that way and OM doesn't understand dependency, it's going to just resolve into the main operator and basically forget to installing the dependent operator along with that. And I feel like this problem at whole is not specifically to this enhancement specifically, but it's the fact that OM doesn't have any cap compatibility matrix at all. That, you know, about this version of OM actually support the version of registry and so on, or different cap API that we support in this version and not in that version. We don't have any cap matrix for that. So it's become a problem with the fact that people don't even know about this. When they look at OM in general, let's say like, oh, this version support this and on that. So this become in some way documentation problem in the way we handling API compatibility. And I'm not sure if this EP is supposed to address that or in some way try to avoid that problem, because I think this is a deeper problem than just this specific thing. Go ahead, Joe.
I don't think I have anything else. I guess like my main point is, well, there's like 2 or 3 main points, I guess. Like whatever, I don't really care really what the ending solution is, as long as like from a user perspective, it's easy and obvious to define constraints. And if we have a bunch of unrelated fields all intermingled together, it becomes really hard for a user to know which fields to populate for which constraints. So I think we want to avoid that problem. I think the other thing is, like, on some level, whether or not OLM is making decisions about whether it can interpret a constraint or not as a constraint, it seems like it's valuable for OLM to at least be able to disambiguate and know the intent is for this to be a constraint or the intent is not, right? And then we can later decide, like, okay, well, what does that actually mean? If we don't have the ability to disambiguate, then we don't have the ability to do anything else other than ignore. So like in my mind, those are the things that we need this API to be able to have answers for.
Yeah, so Joe bring up the point that the way the resolver at the moment is having a set of specific type, which is considered dependency, in this case constraint. And if anything else doesn't fail into those list of type, it's considered property, meaning it doesn't have anything to do with, we need this dependency to be installed and so on. And that's the current behavior. And unfortunately, what Joe just said, that if this OM type constraint be introduced and OM doesn't know it existing, it's basically another property and everything just fell through, and no way for us to be detecting that there's an unrecognizable dependency.
Yeah,
so we can changing that behavior a little bit in some way, that literally having a supported list of type that we're supporting regardless if they are property or dependency. And anything more than that, we're rejecting it. But that will be conflicting with the fact we're actually supporting a posteriori property in the registry. In terms of like arbitrary property, that means that you can adding any property you want into the property.yaml in the bundle metadata, and registry will accepting it, even though OM resolver doesn't have the way to understand it. And if we're saying that the resolver will rejecting them, then the registry should reject them in the first place. So there's a little bit of conflict of interest, so to speak, in this scenario. If anyone have any further talk on that, I know we don't have a lot of time left, and we still have a few items that we need to go through. Mostly we need to push them to the next meeting if everyone okay with that, if we want to continue with this conversation.
Yeah, I guess my last item is a pretty quick one. So if we could just allocate 2 minutes at the end to cover that one, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. We can sort of, I will give you kind of 5 minutes in the end. I will try to wrapping this thing up in the next few minutes. I know we're still having the cluster constraint EP that I have up. I haven't seen any feedback or comment on that EP specifically. I assume everyone haven't had a chance to see it yet. It's related to this EP as well. They have a broader sister gap scenario for the enhancement. So I would love if anyone take a bit more time to look into that enhancement and have some comment on that. And I know the compile constraint from Eric have a few comment on that already, and I think Eric has been responding to that. So if you guys have any further input, feel free to continue to adding more feedback if you need to. And for this specific enhancement, I feel like the main concern is still the syntax, and there are a few things here and there that it seems like maybe we need another round of review and having some specific comment on that topic and expand from there. Because we run out of time, and I would love to have Chris to go over his last point. All right, I'm gonna just cap this meeting for this specific epic enhancement for now, and then any further comment on the enhancement, and I will discuss from there. And I want to let Chris have a chance to talk about his curated catalog. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thanks. So Nancy, you're on the call with me, I think, too, so you can kind of clarify anything I screw up. But anyways, the bottom line is that we're going to have a bunch of different catalog sources. So today, IBM, we have one monster one, right, that has everything in it, which makes everything pretty simple. With our air gap approach, we currently have different catalog sources. So every product essentially has its own catalog source, which again is okay because nothing overlaps. So in our new world, especially with OPM Alpha Diff and the other mirroring tools, customers will be building their own catalogs. And our product, we're thinking of changing the way that we deliver our products. So we have this thing called a case, which is basically it's a proprietary, packaging format that we use to describe, what product, what makes up the product, what are all the images and so forth, and what are the OLM artifacts in there. And so we're thinking about actually packaging up the file-based catalog, that JSON or YAML file, to describe all of the packages that make up the product, which could include dependent packages. So there's possibilities that these catalogs that we ship with products may overlap. And it's also a possibility that these catalogs that customers build or that are shipped to our customers may actually have different sets of constraints in them. And they might, even though they're overlapping, they might overlap slightly differently. So the scenario that I painted here is, let's say, for example, right, you have two catalogs, A and B, and they both depend on the same operator package C, but one of them requires a slightly newer version, right? So the real question is, what are we expecting our customers to deal with catalog sources? Are we expecting, so the problem, of course, is that if you had created a subscription for A, right, which uses catalog source A, and it automatically created subscription C through the dependency management stuff, it's going to be bound to that old catalog source, right? So if they install B later on, who needs also C, but a newer version, it's never going to resolve because the subscription doesn't magically change itself to use a different catalog source. And so it's a lot of work for the customer to realize what's going on and change the catalog source that's on a subscription. So I'm wondering if you guys had thought about this, and is the best practice to have the customer use a singleton catalog source and use the new merge capability inside OPM render? Is that the kind of the thought process on doing that? Should we use a singleton and have the customer use one catalog source for their entire set of subscriptions, or is it going to be more complicated than that?
This is probably too long of a conversation for 1 minute, but
okay.
and we should definitely leave it for next time. But I don't think there's a reason to call like render. You could probably just host both at the same time, because I think to OLM it's the same. It's the same.
But they're not, because you'd have a subscription that's already created pointing to the old catalog, which doesn't have the newer versions of the operator in it. Right, so you have A and B both pointing to C, and somehow C needs to get upgraded.
Well, OLM treats them as the same because they're well, unless they are of different priorities, then I believe they're just
yeah. So that's
randomized
only
somehow.
so Eric. So that is only the case when doing initial resolution, right?
Correct.
OLM doesn't once the operator has been installed, it's just its own subscription. There's no dependency resolution that can update a subscription to point to a different catalog.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's
So
the
these
problem
are-
I'm
Like
running
the
into.
the resolution of being picked from whatever catalog is only in the case where nothing is installed and it's picking something to install. It stamps that as subscription, and then that's just an independently installed operator.
Gotcha. Okay. So in the interest of time, let me gather my thoughts for next time and have a more thorough discussion about this. But
I guess, do you
yeah,
guys, is this good enough? Could we take this? I think we have a kind of an imminent request. Can I take this to Slack? And would you guys be interested in reading this on Slack?
Yeah,
That
absolutely.
sounds reasonable.
Yeah,
All right, I'll move this discussion to Slack and we'll start there.
yeah, absolutely. Feel free to continue this conversation on the OM dev Slack, on Kubernetes Slack for sure. And based on that conversation that you're gonna continue up there, and if you want, discuss further on the next upstream meeting, feel free to add them to the agenda again. That should not be a problem. And similar story for the pending enhancement, I will gonna bring them up again in next meeting until we decided to merge them or close them, because that's basically the talking point for this meeting, to discussing feature and stuff like that. So that should be fine. And I think we're at time now. So thank you everyone for joining. This has been a wonderful discussion, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. And have a great day. Bye-bye.
thanks everybody.